Good morning, Chris.
Good morning, Eric.
Good morning, Lindsay. Good morning, Vanessa.
Good morning.
Well, we're at the top of the hour. Should we?
We can, Dan, I think we were expecting your co-chair.
Yeah.
So there she is. She just popped on.
Oh, perfect. Hi, Barbara. Can you hear us, Barbara?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. We're not seeing you, but that's okay. I'll probably just kick it off for us this morning. Oh, there you
There
are.
you go. Can you hear me now, Dan?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Sorry. My
No worries.
computer's really slow today.
Yeah, my computer up here is always slow. So I can relate. Good morning, committee members, and those joining on YouTube. For the record, my name is Dan Brown, and I co-chair the grant committee with Barbara Boyer. And we want to remind you all that this virtual meeting is being streamed live on OWEB's YouTube channel and also recorded. For those watching on YouTube, the meeting materials are in the board and committee section of the OWEB website. So you can access those materials there. They're towards the bottom of the page. And if you just click on the relevant committee, you'll see the meeting materials for this meeting, as well as past meetings and meeting recordings. I'm gonna ask the committee members and OWEB staff to introduce themselves. And then we can roll into the agenda. So let me get back over here so I can see who's on. Barbara, do you want to go first as the co-chair of this committee?
Sure, I will. Barbara Boyer, co-chair of the OWEB board and co-chair of the grants committee. And I sit on the board as a member of the Oregon State Board of Agriculture. And my screen is doing all kinds of funky stuff, so I'm going to go off for a little bit and see what it does.
Yeah, you're bouncing around like a video game or something. Great. Liz, would you like to go?
Yes, my name is Liz Agpawa, and I'm a board member and on the committee for the grants, and I sit on the board as a member of the Oregon Board of Forestry.
All right. Mark?
Good morning, everybody. Mark Labhart, and I'm on the board as a member from the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and represent the commission.
Thanks, Mark. Chris, good morning.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. I sit on OWEB's board as a non-voting member representing the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Thanks, Chris. Lindsay, good morning.
Good morning, everybody. For the record, Lindsay McClary, public at-large voting member on the OWEB board, and I'm located in Salem.
Thanks, Lindsay. I think is that it for board members?
Yes.
All right. Why don't we move to OWEB staff? Lisa, do you want to kick us off? Well, Maybe. Here she comes. No. How about you, Eric? Well, Lisa's getting back connected.
All right. Hi, everybody. Eric Williams. I'm the grant program manager at OWEB.
All right. There's Lisa back. We're just doing intros, Lisa, if you want to.
Thanks. I was trying to get sound and video working. Sorry, for whatever reason, it was hung up this morning. So good morning. I'm Lisa Sharplow Hansen, Executive Director at OWEB. I'm happy to see everybody.
Great. Eric Hartstein.
Good morning, everyone. Eric Hartstein, OWEB staff, board, and legislative policy coordinator.
All right. How about Liz?
Good morning, everyone. Liz Redon. I'm the regional program representative covering the Willamette Valley.
All right. Ken.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Ken Fetcho, and I am OWEB's Effectiveness Monitoring Coordinator and Tribal Liaison.
And Vanessa.
Good morning. I'm just a guest today. I'm Vanessa Green, the Executive Director of the Network of Oregon Watershed Councils. Queued up for public comment.
Right on. And let me just do another scroll. Okay, Kristen.
Hi, Kristen Larson, Lucky Mute Watershed Council, also queued up for public comment, and then I'll depart. Thank you.
All right, and April.
Good morning, April Mack for OWEB. I am the assistant to our director and to our board.
And we're so happy for you, April, and so sad that this is going to be your last time joining us on this meeting.
Thank you.
Okay, let's just quickly walk through the agenda items, and then we'll jump right into the next agenda item. So we're going to do public comments. We have received written comments from Kelly Timchak and Jan Lee, and we have 3 people signed up for public testimony this morning, 2 of who you've already were introduced to this morning, Kristen and Vanessa. And we also have Chris Gannon signed up. And that will be agenda item 2. Agenda item 3 will be council and district operating capacity funding. Agenda item 4 is stage 0 effectiveness monitoring request. Agenda item 5 is the Oregon Ag Heritage Program request. And finally, agenda item 6 is open solicitation grant request. And so, unless someone has any questions or comments about the agenda, I will hand it over to Barbara or whoever's kicking off our public comment section.
So I will take that, Dan. Thank you. And in regards to April, you know, it's sad to see her leave OWEB, but I'm part of the conservation district world in the state, so I get to still work with her. So
yay!
I was pretty excited about that.
She can run, but she can't hide.
So, all right. So now we're on agenda number 2, which is public comment. And we have 3 people signed up to give public testimony today, and you will each have 3 minutes. So Kristen Larson, I will start with you, please.
Okay, thank you. For the record, Kristen Larson, Lucky Mute Watershed Council in Independence, and I'm here today to offer public comment in support of the staff proposal for capacity grants. As noted in the staff report, watershed councils and districts each play a unique role in their communities to help implement local restoration, conservation goals, and implement state and federal plans. We partner with our SWCDs in different ways and often complement each other's programs. In addition, districts and councils are both called out specifically in the Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds that solutions addressing limiting factors will be implemented through a local context involving watershed councils, SWCDs, OSU Extension, landowners, and other local entities and stakeholders. Implementing community-based voluntary actions, particularly with private landowners, relies on the ability to develop trust and build relationships, which takes a significant amount of time and capacity. Capacity funding supports this important work. Councils and districts are not only partners to each other, but partners to OWEB in carrying out the Oregon Plan in our communities. Not all watershed councils have nonprofit status, but most operate in that model, competing for grants from OWEB, other state and federal agencies and private foundations, and building and soliciting partner and donor support. This important work relies on the capacity of an organization to develop those projects, do the important engagement and relationship building work, and critically, manage the overall operations and governance of their organizations to be transparent, accountable, and efficient with resources. Just as OWEB is taking a hard look at its operations and capacity, and recognizing increased capacity will allow it to maintain its high-quality delivery of programs, respond to emerging issues such as drought, wildfire recovery, and climate change, and navigate new and different funding streams, so too are watershed councils navigating similar challenges. Increasing capacity funding as proposed would be a worthwhile investment to support the important work of organizational management and governance, responding to local emerging issues, and engaging our communities in developing projects, all of which lead to high level of leveraging funds and getting work out into communities and on the ground. For example, in 2022 alone, the Lucky Mute Watershed Council had just over $1 million in program-related expenses, leveraging the one-year portion of our capacity grant approximately 13-to-1 with other funding. And just as a brief example, our council capacity funding allowed us and 4 other watershed council partners to continue our Mid-Valley River Connections partnership and pursue an OWEB technical assistance grant that in turn will be used to pursue large-scale regional restoration funding, such as NOAA's Community Habitat Restoration Program grant. With capacity support, we're more able to work with our partners, explore win-win opportunities, and scale up to pursue larger scale funding opportunities to get more work on the ground. So I support the staff's proposal, and I ask you to support it as well. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Kristen. All right, Vanessa, you are queued up, please.
Excellent. Thank you, Co-Chairs Brown and Boyer. For the record, my name is Vanessa Green, and I'm the Executive Director of the Network of Oregon Watershed Councils, known as NOWC. I want to take a moment alongside Kristen to convey wide Watershed Council support for the ideas expressed in the OWEB staff memo that you are scheduled to discuss in a few minutes regarding the council and district operating capacity funding for the next biennium. As the staff memo notes, watershed councils play an essential and unique role in our state, and we follow the statutes established in 1997 by the Oregon legislature. We establish bridges between OWEB and local communities, and we sustain partnerships that are prepared to work together in complex and large-scale ways to meet our statewide restoration goals. Councils vary from each other as our communities and ecological habitats also vary from one another. But in general, watershed councils' strengths lie in their ability to be nimble as they adapt and lead in evolving situations. Watershed councils do require operational capacity in order to be nimble in our communities and to operate with efficiency. And there's so many stories of times when there's behind the scenes works that results in significant partnership outcomes that might seem effortless, but I want to highlight one for you today. Earlier this month, I was really pleased to see a new position that was advertised for an Upper Willamette tribal liaison who will be working to make sure that tribal priorities are always at the forefront of land management decisions. And they will build and support collaborative relationships among tribal governments and the Eugene Water and Electric Board and the Upper Willamette Stewardship Network, which includes 4 watershed councils. That's the Mackenzie River, the Long Tom, the Coast Fork Willamette, and the Middle Fork Willamette. And this relationship building and project development behind this one job opportunity that was just advertised was definitely not effortless. It literally took years of strategic plans and doodle polls and Zoom meetings and cups of coffee and iterative drafts, all of that. But most importantly, the investment in professional people with wide skill sets in order to achieve that goal. So I'm just really excited to see what's going to come from this group as they leverage their efforts together. NOWC supports the proposed changes for Watershed Council capacity funding, and we ask for your support as well. And that's it. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Vanessa. All right, moving on down to our third. We don't. Is there anybody else besides Chris signed up for public comment? April?
No.
Okay, thank you. So Chris, are you there? Chris Gannon, are you on?
You know, honestly, I'm not sure. I think I might be. Can you
Yep.
give me some indication if you can hear me?
I can hear you,
Yes?
Chris, loud and
Oh,
clear.
thank you so much. I apologize. I've had some issues connecting this morning through Zoom, so I'm going the old-fashioned way. I do want to say good morning, committee members and staff. And I do want to express my support for the proposed capacity program allocation and amounts made by OWEB staff in the March 9th memo. You guys all know this, but council work is very similar and often coordinated with local SWCDs. So in terms of sort of districts and councils, we do a lot of the very same kind of work on the ground. And I guess in my mind, it makes good sense. It's a good business practice to kind of try to close the gap on the funding levels. So that's a big reason why we support the proposal. We understand it may never be exactly the same in terms of those allocations, and that's okay. But to the degree we can close the gap, it sure makes a lot of sense to address any potential inequities in our work. But, you know, perhaps more important than that kind of basic view is that our projects, especially developing projects, pre-project activities, you might say, are becoming more and more complex. And in fact, they require a lot more coordination with partners, and a lot of that pre-project kind of proposal development coordination really requires a lot more detailed information, engineered designs, kind of concept designs, you might say. So I just wanted to point out that the work itself, restoration work itself, is becoming much more complex, and specifically all the work and activity councils have to do before a project actually becomes sort of a reality in terms of a grant application is really where we spend a lot of our time and a lot of our sort of resource hours, you might say. And in fact, that's all I wanted to say. I thank you very much. You have a big task in front of you, and we wish you well. We would ask that you please join us in supporting the staff's recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And then for the record, I wanted to say that we did receive 2 written public comment from Kelly Timchik and Jan Lee. So those are, I think they are online, correct, Eric or April? The written public comments are accessible online.
Yes, they will be.
All right, Mark, you have a question?
Yes,
Or a comment?
I apologize. I don't know Chris. And he didn't introduce where he was from. Is he the one from the Crooked River Watershed Council? So I apologize. I didn't get where he was from.
Yes.
I apologize as well. Yes, I'm Chris Gannon from the Crooked River Watershed Council. For the record, I'm the executive director.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mark. All right, so no more public comment, written or verbal. So I will pass the baton to item number 3 to Dan, please.
All right, thank you, Barbara. And agenda item 3 is a follow-up to those public comments. And I believe Liz is going to run us through the council and district operating capacity funding.
Great.
And we received the memo, of course, in our packet material. So take it away, Liz.
Thank you, Dan. So good morning again. I am actually sitting in for Courtney Schaff to talk about Watershed Council and Soil and Water Conservation District operating capacity funding that's described in the memo. And before I jump into the memo, I just wanted to pause and talk about why OWEB invests in capacity funding for so long. And you may recall in my last board presentation, I mentioned that I like to dive into statute to get a little inspiration. And so I did that again, and I took a look at our statutes around councils and districts just to orient myself and remind myself what it says. And so I actually pulled these out, and I only have a couple of slides, so it's not too many, that I thought might be helpful to walk through just to starting out this conversation. And what I noticed is that we often tend to look at the statute that specifically authorizes OWEB to be able to invest in capacity for districts and councils. But preceding that statute, so that statute, the one says OWEB may invest in capacity grants. But preceding that statute, there's quite a bit of statute references to councils and districts that I found is really helpful to look at. And starting at the top, so this first part is the statute around the Oregon Plan. And starting at the top, it says it's the policy of the state of Oregon that voluntary programs initiated at the local level to protect and enhance the quality and stability of watersheds are a high priority of the state. And then moving down, it says the Oregon Plan is a comprehensive program for recovery of species and the restoration of watersheds throughout the state. And it includes voluntary activities undertaken by watershed councils, soil and water conservation districts, landowners, and other entities. And then finally, it says the Oregon Plan shall rely on watershed councils and soil and water conservation districts that are doing things like watershed plans, monitoring, and implementing projects. So that's the Oregon Plan section. And then if you move down in the statute, it's a little bit more, there's a section break, and it has administration of the Oregon Plan. And that's where the OWEB rules start, or the statutes start. And what it shows is that the first thing I notice is that there's this section on the implementation of grant programs. And it indicates that OWEB will work with agencies and tribes and watershed councils and soil and water conservation districts to facilitate the implementation of grant programs. So it's one of the first references. And then you move down and it has this part about the management program. It says the OWEB shall initiate a watershed management program that relies on the establishment of voluntary local watershed councils. And then there's these two sections around the duties of the board. And the first one shows that OWEB shall conduct a watershed program that provides the greatest possible opportunity for volunteer participation. So reflecting on that Oregon Plan language again, and that the board shall grant funds for the support of watershed councils, and again, assessing watershed and creating action plans, implementing projects. And then finally, there's this other reference at the bottom here, duties of the board again, that OWEB shall establish a framework for locally based integrated watershed planning to assist watershed councils and soil and water conservation districts, and to support the efforts of watershed councils and soil and water conservation districts. And then it's below that there's that statute that says OWEB may grant funds for capacity. And so my takeaway for that when I was reading through those is you do see this rationale for supporting councils and districts woven into the statute and around the Oregon Plan and the duties of the OWEB board that I thought was just helpful context for thinking about capacity investments. So now I'm going to move to the memo and just expand on some of the points in the background of the memo and talk a little bit about what we as staff have noticed about investing in capacity for districts and councils. And what we've noticed is that stable long-term capacity funds have allowed councils and districts to implement the Oregon Plan by working with landowners and land managers to voluntarily implement projects that have ranged from things like riparian plantings to dam removal, to upland oak and prairie habitat restoration, to irrigation improvements, and so much more with a variety of complex projects. These organizations have adapted as we collectively learn about the priorities affecting Oregon watersheds. Early on, we knew a lot about Endangered Species Act listed fish like salmon and steelhead, and also water quality. So a lot of the projects focused on those particular issues. But over time, what we understand about our watersheds has evolved, and there's been several emerging issues that have needed attention, like the declining oak habitat. We've learned more about the degree of those habitats have been impacted. And also now we're learning more about climate change and how that impacts our watersheds. And thinking about how do we ensure all people are engaged in watershed work. And these groups, the districts and the councils, they really do the heavy lifting on the ground and translating all this scientific learning about the watersheds, and then working with communities to help community members learn about these issues, and then work together on problem solving about how to address them within their watershed communities to restore our watersheds. So they do the heavy lifting that's been really important to see change in our watersheds. Also, what we've learned is that the working relationships of districts and councils have established in their watershed communities with capacity funds have made them responsive to emergencies, such as getting those fire recovery dollars working on the ground that we received recently. Stories from Lake County and McKenzie Watershed have indicated that having districts and councils leveraging their skills and the established relationships that they've built over time was pivotal in having a coordinated response to catastrophic fires. Recovery of the natural resources in these areas would have been significantly delayed in the absence of councils and districts that were ready to partner and take early action to stabilize the conditions in these watersheds. Readily available funds alone is not enough without that capacity built over time. And what that reminds me of is just thinking about how many quotes out there are about preparation meeting opportunity. You really need to have those trust relationships built. So when the emergency occurs, they can be activated and move to working together and solving the problem. Finally, continued capacity funding will allow councils and districts to be readily available to capture the flush of implementation dollars that are coming from opportunities such as the federal infrastructure funding. And we heard that a little bit reflected in our comment this morning, and that OWEB capacity investments have played and can continue to play a transformative role in Oregon watersheds by investing in the capacity needed. So those groups can be ready to capture those funds and get on the ground projects completed that are benefiting our watersheds. So that's a little bit more on the background. And now I'm going to shift to highlighting some key points in the memo. There will be an opportunity for us to learn more about how capacity investments are working with the retrospective analysis that Oregon State University is doing. And that will be presented at the June meeting for this committee. Also, I want to highlight that the amount of capacity investment in the spending plan has not changed since the 2011-2013 biennium. So it has stayed static over several biennia spending plan, and that's that large lump sum for all the groups. And then also, there has been a gap, this was referenced in some of the comments this morning, there has been a gap in the amounts that watershed councils have received in their capacity grants compared to what soil and water conservation districts have received. And so what we're proposing as staff for the 23-25 biennium spending plan is to increase that spending plan item. So what it has been is a little over 15 million for a biennium that gets split up into the groups. And we're proposing an increase to 17,793 and some change. And what that will do for us and for these groups is, one, it will allow for a 5% cost of living increase for soil and water conservation districts. And it'll also work to closing that gap between what watershed councils receive and what the districts receive. And our intent for this recommendation is to raise all boats. We can see that both watershed councils and districts are valuable to have in place in our watershed communities to create that on the ground voluntary effort that's described in the Oregon plan. And so this increase allows them to do things like retain skilled staff that we heard very clearly are important to developing these complex projects. And so they can continue doing what they do well in our watersheds. And so we're just looking for committee feedback that will help us develop a proposal to bring to the full board in April. And so with that, I will open up to questions and welcome any feedback you have on our proposal.
All right, board members, questions? Lindsay.
Yeah, thank you for that great presentation and background, as well as the public comment. My camera is also acting up, so I think I'm going to turn it off, but had a couple things to say. One, it's so important to have people on the ground to be able to facilitate the good restoration work where OWEB dollars go. And as a practitioner in this field, I rely heavily on SWCDs and Watershed Council partnerships for collaboration. It really provides a holistic approach. We're all on the same team. And it really helps me leverage dollars and also stretch dollars to be able to get more work done on the ground with those dollars. Recognizing that not all OWEB board members are here on the grant committee, I would strongly encourage us all to be that voice to the larger board expressing how important this is. I support the proposal in the memo. And then just a quick note, I recognize that Kelly Coates is not part of this committee. And she's the tribal liaison, but I do just want to mention that really people on the landscape doing good work in conservation is really true to a tribal perspective. I mean, tribes have always been on the landscape, and conservation and good work is not exclusive of humans. It's actually inclusive, and we're part of the ecosystem. So that's all I've got. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. Other board members? Barbara.
All right, thank you, thank you. So as a district member, like Lindsay, you know, the work is really important between watershed councils and conservation districts. But I keep hearing this word today from public comment and then from Liz about gaps. So yes, the figure is 17 million, but when you do the breakdown, it's actually, what is it? It's 9.5 million for watershed councils and 8.3 for conservation districts. So there is, you know, I look at it in that lens. So there's, I'm trying to figure out where the gap is there. And then I'm curious if any staff members have actually reached out to districts about this proposal.
So you mean to the individual districts? I can say there was a conversation that Courtney had with ODA. Do you want to hear about that?
Okay, but I know there's been a lot of communication with watershed councils about this proposal, but I'm just curious if there's been any outreach to conservation districts, individual ones.
So I'll respond a little bit to that.
Yeah,
and then Barbara, I would, it's all good. For the record, Lisa Sherpel-Hansen. Barbara, I did reach out to a couple of districts to have a conversation. And it was met with needing to do some more thought around it. And that was before we had done much work to get as far as we have in bringing this proposal to the committee. And I think if you have some additional districts for us to do outreach to get some more feedback prior to the board meeting, I am happy to do that work and have those conversations and see if that provides us some additional foundation for the discussion.
Thank you. Go ahead, Liz.
I can speak to the gap reference too. So the gap that Courtney was referring to in the staff report, it's the individual wards. So there are more watershed councils than conservation districts. And so what happens when you split that, the 8 million and the 9 million that you see in the spending plan, is that gets divided up even more. So there's more pieces of the pie being cut for watershed councils from their allocation compared to districts. And so when closing the gap, the reference is, again, raising all boats, though all the organizations have some lift in terms of capacity, since the pie gets cut up in smaller slices for watershed council, a little bit more funding is needed. But the overall result is watershed councils, there's not going to be complete parity just because of funding limitations. And so watershed councils still won't get the same award as districts. Districts will continue to have slightly higher awards. That's why we didn't say bring it to parity, but rather close the gap some. Does that help?
Yes, and then one last comment. I know the Teacham Conservation District has been trying really hard to qualify. So I wonder what would happen if they came on board. Would the funding level be raised to 46 conservation districts, or what would that look like? Would they have to wait to the next biennium and then that ratio gets changed?
I'm looking at Lisa. Do you want to?
Sorry.
So I don't remember a conversation about an additional district. I mean, we did reach out to one of the counties that has multiple districts to have some of that conversation there, but not Teacham. That's nothing it's not clicking, you know, in Lisa's Rolodex of conversations that have happened recently, Barbara. So if there's something we need to do there, let me know.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. We got Chris queued up and then Mark.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, for the record, Chris Allen, a board member. This feels like a kind of a minor question, Liz, but first, thanks for your presentation. That was helpful. Both in the staff memo and in your remarks, you mentioned cost of living raise for the district side of it, but but you didn't note that either in your remarks or in the staff memo as supporting rationale for council as well. I'm just curious why that discrepancy. Is that intentional?
No, it's not necessarily intentional, but the limitation of the funding. And so historically, watershed councils have always been awarded less individually. And so the framing is close the gap, because we're not going to be able to lift them just in terms of what's available, lift them to have complete parity with districts. So it's not like we're increasing for cost of living. We're just trying to get their boat up more even with district on the individual district to council comparison. So that's why it wasn't framed as an additional cost of living. It's more of a close the gap to bring their boat up with districts. It is an increase from what they've received historically, with a 5% increase for cost of living. But we can't quite give that same amount of lift for watershed councils because of the money available for us.
All right. Thanks for that explanation.
Thanks, Chris. Mark?
So, Liz, my question has to do around the statute, and you went through that pretty fast for me, but is there anything in there? I just want to make sure we're on good footing here with our decision. Anything in those statutes that require or allude to that we will have a roughly 50-50 split, or does the statute particularly remain silent on how that distribution is to occur?
It's a great question. The statute is silent, and I actually, because I was showing the statutes that we don't usually look at, that the statute you're referring to is the one where it says OEB may fund capacity, but that's all it really says. So it even gives you sort of this kind of vague language around that, so you can define how it looks, but that's all it says. It doesn't tell you what the distribution is or amount. It just says you may grant funds for these capacity elements or staffing of these organizations.
Okay, so discretionary. So the second question is for you, Lisa. So if we as a grant committee recommend to the full board approval of this, is in the 23-25 biennial budget, which you have had review with the legislative subcommittee, we are adequately funded to do this. Is that correct?
In the current proposal that we shared with you at the January board meeting, we had put additional funding in for capacity based on what we had heard from partners at the October meeting when we were in Tillamook. There was a lot of discussion around capacity during our January board meeting. So it's one of the balancers in terms of the cash that's available for the board to put into their spending plan. I think one of the challenges that is fascinating in all of this from a policy perspective, and I'll just give you my opinion of it. Oregon relies heavily on these local organizations for all of our natural resource implementation, whether it be a soil and water conservation district, a watershed council, tribes, NGOs, or the Oregon plan, which is the part of the basis of OWEB, relies on these local entities to do the work and not necessarily state staff. I think when the Oregon plan was developed, the vision was that local entities would do voluntary work and that they needed in their local communities to address the diversity that we have across Oregon in all different ways, north, south, east, west, topography, climate, and everything else that goes with all things beautiful about the Oregon diversity. And we have continued to rely on these entities to do work. The challenge is they can get funding for projects, but you have to have some base to be able to apply for funding, to be able to do the planning, to be able to do the technical assistance and outreach. And that's harder to obtain funding for. There are some areas, in the state where soil and water conservation districts have a tax base. That's incredibly helpful. because it bumps up that infrastructure foundation for them. But where there are smaller entities, they really rely on these capacity dollars to give them the flexibility to do that work, to obtain the funding for the on the ground projects. And over, as we've been working through, you know, issues with coming back from the pandemic, a lot of federal money coming down, there's money for projects, but where we really struggle, and what I really hear from the local entities, is having the funding available to have staffing that can do that planning, that can do the grant writing. And, you know, OWEB staff, help me, you know the structure even better than I do, but it's maintaining the infrastructure to do the work. There's similar conversations, I think, in some ways that we have talked with you about here at OWEB, in terms of having the infrastructure to do the work that's needed to do the prep part of it.
So couldn't agree with you more, but just hopefully I can get a yes on this. So the 17 million that we are proposing to the OWEB board, it is in our budget. And if the legislature approves our budget in June, we will be adequately funded to fund the 17 million. Is that a yes? Okay.
It's a yes, because remember, it's in the grant side of the budget.
Right.
And the OWEB board has the authority and the responsibility to create a spending plan, which is basically a budget for those grant dollars. The legislature gives us limitation to spend the grant dollars. And so there are choices that the board is going to have to make, policy choices between the different categories of open solicitation, focus investment, operating capacity, and other. I'm looking up because I keep a spending plan on a pegboard in front of my desk to look at on a regular basis, in terms of how those are allocated.
And I'll just close with a comment. I'm a very strong supporter of adequate funding for both watershed councils and soil water conservation districts. So strong support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I don't see any other hands raised. I had one comment myself for more of a question, Liz, on the OSU report that's coming out. I'm just kind of curious. Clearly, this seems like a very unique model to the state of Oregon. And I'm wondering if that OSU report is going to kind of do any kind of comparison of how this works in Oregon versus like what other states do, or maybe other states don't do anything, and how we're at an advantage because of this.
I have not been involved in the report, but I see I have a friend that will chime in that has been involved in the report. So I'll ask Ken to go ahead and respond. Thanks, Ken.
Great.
No problem. Hi, everybody. It's Ken Fetcho. I'm OWEB's Effectiveness Monitoring Coordinator, and working closely with Courtney Schaff on this project, with U of O and OSU that are both working on this project. And the answer to your question, Dan, is no. We will not be comparing it to another state.
Okay.
Anecdotally, though, we do hear that our model for these community-based organizations is very unique. And we had brief time, but I wish I could talk a little bit more about what I learned from Renee about the fire recovery grants, that there are some comparisons that she's heard anecdotally in other states where a catastrophic fire has occurred, and getting those natural resource recovery actions on the ground has been a lot more difficult because they don't have groups like councils and districts and other nonprofits ready to go. And they're definitely are envious of what Oregon has, because we are able to get action on the ground quickly.
Yeah, I suspect Oregon is at a significant advantage because of the capacity that has been created it'd be just nice to incorporate that in part of the story on this, I think. Lisa, were you trying to say something?
Yeah, the only other thing I would add is, so I'm most familiar on the side of the non-point source programs for agriculture, and how Oregon compares to other states. And our program is completely unique to other states. Other states have what are called Ag Practices Act, and so they're very, very prescriptive. Because of the diversity in Oregon, again, north, south, east, west, climate, topography, types of agriculture, everything else, there has been a system established for our state that really allows for more flexibility in terms of how we approach natural resource issues. And these local entities are incredibly important because they know those local regions. And I see Barbara nodding her head because we've had over time, my history working with Barbara in my old world and now in my new world, we've had so many of these conversations in terms of how do you, catapult that work forward. And we also rely on not just meeting a base of actions for certain things, we rely on uplift, which are additional actions above and beyond what a regulatory base might look like. And so the local entities really are the ones that help to move that along.
Thank you. So just to wrap up this agenda item, as the committee here, it sounds like we are all in favor of supporting this action at the full board meeting. And so I think we're ready to roll into agenda item 4, and I'm going to hand that over to Barbara to lead off.
Thank you, Dan. All right, we are moving on down, and Ken Fetcho is going to give us a presentation, right? Is it Ken, right? On stage 0? Okay, thank you.
Yep. Morning, everybody. For the record, again, my name is Ken Fetcho, and I'm OWEB's Effectiveness Monitoring Coordinator. And I'm just going to share my screen. I have a short PowerPoint presentation for all of you. Let's see here. I'm going to do that. I'm going to do this. I can see you, Liz. Can you see my slide deck?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Thank you. And again, you can help me if there's questions. I have a limited view of everybody this morning based on my screens. So today I'll be providing background to help prepare for the April board meeting, where staff will be requesting up to $470,000 from the Quantifying Conservation Outputs and Outcomes line item in the 21-23 spending plan to continue effectiveness monitoring of large-scale restoration projects in Whitechoose Creek and the South Fork Mackenzie River. And the intent of this presentation is to provide an overview of this proposal to see if you have any questions or concerns before bringing it to the full board in April. And, we have a lot on the agenda today, and we only have a limited amount of time to discuss this proposal. And so when I was preparing for this presentation, Courtney and Eric really advised me to just provide ample written materials. And so that has been provided under the 3-page funding memo with 3 attachments, and you guys should have received that before the meeting today. So relying on that information will be very helpful today. And then we'll have more time at the board meeting in April. So what is stage 0 restoration? Well, first we need to talk about what stage 0 is. So stage 0 refers to a stage of stream channel form based on channel evolution models that were developed in the 80s. Originally, channel evolution models started at stage 1. Then in 2013, Brian Kluwer and Colin Thorne produced a really innovative journal article that proposed a precursor stage, which is stage 0. And this stage represents a multi-threaded channel that is connected with the floodplain at multiple flow stages that creates more ecologically valuable habitat than a single threaded channel that is separated from its floodplain. This theory challenges the general assumption that alluvial streams were predominantly single-threaded in their natural pre-disturbed condition. And so for more information on this channel evolution model and its habitat and ecosystem benefits, please see attachment A. So one restoration approach to restore a stream channel to a stage 0 condition in depositional valleys involves diverting the stream to allow heavy equipment to operate. Then flood embankments and road beds are removed to fill the incised channel. The entire floodplain is graded to increase connectivity and a variety of flows, and an abundant amount of large woody debris is added to create habitat. Where large vegetated islands exist, care is taken to retain these features to add to the habitat complexity once stream flows return to the restoration reach. Funding for these large-scale monitoring projects began back in 2019. And at the July 19 board meeting in Klamath Falls, the board approved a staff request for up to $360,000 for monitoring and information sharing associated with restoring a stream channel to a stage 0 condition. And so at that time, when we were working with the board, we really framed this as a staged funding request, with initial funding being provided during the 1921 biennium, and subsequent funding would be provided in the 21-23 biennium based on progress reporting to the board. And so 3 grants were awarded as a result of that initial funding that was provided in 2019. And so one was a monitoring grant that was provided to the McKenzie Watershed Council to perform effectiveness monitoring of a multi-phase restoration project in the South Fork McKenzie River, and also data compilation and synthesis of existing monitoring data for several stage 0 projects across the state. And the second monitoring grant was provided to the Upper Deschutes Watershed Council for effectiveness monitoring, including developing and implementing remote sensing approaches of a multi-phase restoration project in White Shoes Creek. And the third grant that was provided was a stakeholder engagement grant to the Institute for Natural Resources at Oregon State University to help OWEB plan and convene a workshop to bring together a range of partners to share knowledge, describe concerns and considerations about this innovative restoration approach, identify monitoring and information needs, and articulate best practices for restoring to a stage 0 condition. Some of you may recall that the McKenzie and Upper Deschutes Watershed Council joined a virtual board meeting in July of 21, where they provided an update on the progress they were making at that time with these funds. And so as both of those monitoring grants are wrapping up, and the McKenzie Watershed Council just submitted their final reports earlier this month, and those are under review, and the Upper Deschutes Watershed Council is planning to submit their final reports in April. And the workshop was held in November of 2020, and we have that was recorded as a 2-day workshop that's on our website with a comprehensive report that sort of summarized the information that was shared. And so at that, when they presented in 2021, both watershed councils explained that restoration and monitoring efforts have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, and the restoration timing was significantly delayed in the South Fork McKenzie due to the 2020 holiday farm fire. And so I've been continuing to work with the grantees as these initial monitoring grants near completion to discuss the needs and timing for a second phase of monitoring. Both of these subsequent monitoring proposals that are in your packet today are building off of the data they collected under the first phase of funding that was provided. In many cases, this funding will allow the partners to capture changes several years after the initial restoration occurred in particular reaches, and in White Shoes Creek, capture post-restoration conditions now that they have been completed. So the funding for the White Shoes Creek will allow the Upper Deschutes Watershed Council to acquire, analyze, and report post-restoration data to measure the geomorphic and physical habitat changes for up to 4 restoration reaches along Waichus Creek. It also fully funds 2 years of macroinvertebrate monitoring to support the evaluation of biological responses to post-restoration conditions in these reaches. And further details on this proposal are provided in attachment B. And for the South Fork Mackenzie, OWEB funding will support the Mackenzie Watershed Council to assess the effects of restoration on 3 reaches along the South Fork Mackenzie River. This proposal will provide support to continue monitoring before a 3rd phase of habitat restoration is anticipated to be completed in 2025. The proposed work will continue ODF&W's monitoring of juvenile Chinook salmon in the project area and support Oregon State University and U.S. Forest Service's remote sensing and ground-based monitoring activities, and also help ensure long-term availability of remote sensing data that was been collected during the initial phase of the project, as well as the data collected during this proposed work. And further details on the South Fork Mackenzie monitoring is provided in attachment C. As I mentioned earlier, the delays associated with COVID-19 and the Holiday Farm Fire has created a need to maintain key data sets before the next phase of restoration will occur in 2025, to continue monitoring and applying lessons learned during the initial phase of effectiveness monitoring so that long-term responses to the restoration can be better evaluated. After restoration is completed in the South Fork Mackenzie River in 2025, we envision that there will be an additional monitoring grant provided to the Mackenzie Watershed Council to support a final phase of the effectiveness monitoring that will 26 to measure effects of that subsequent phase of restoration to maintain the original monitoring design that was initially funded in 2019. And this is really a key distinction between the effectiveness monitoring that's occurring in Waichus Creek. The Upper Deschutes Watershed Council was able to navigate monitoring delays and restoration delays associated with COVID-19 and restoration permitting by accessing interim funding provided by the Nature Conservancy and Portland General Electric, or PGE. So at the upcoming April board meeting, we'll have 45 minutes to dig more into this funding request. Partners from the Upper Deschutes and the Mackenzie Watershed Councils will be joining Courtney and I to present to the board, and they will be providing more information, and that'll include a progress report on the innovative restoration and monitoring efforts, and actually sharing some results with you that came out of that first phase of effectiveness monitoring that OWEB provided. And they'll also just be spending more time digging into the details for each of the monitoring proposals that we'll be asking the board to support. And they'll also just be available to answer any questions the board might have and to have a robust discussion related to monitoring these large-scale, multi-phase restoration projects that are implemented over many years. And so, I'm happy to take any questions now. And just keep in mind that we will have the partners available. So if any things that you guys have questions about today that I may be unable to answer, I'll be able to use that to help prepare our presentation in April. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
It looks like Liz got a question.
I do. Hey, Ken, thank you for your presentation. The only thing that I would ask to be thinking about before our meeting in April is that you mentioned several times the Holiday Farm Fire. And so just some maybe some of your thinking when you do the presentation on, is it important to separate those two? Is it a peripheral piece in your monitoring? Those kinds of things, because that's what kind of pops into my mind, because it was such an impactful disturbance piece for that watershed. And I don't know if there's a ready answer for that at all, but just a thought.
Well, I guess if I may, a follow-up question. When you say, is it important to separate the two? I mean, can you provide a little bit more detail on what you might want to hear?
Well, just some thoughts about when you started the effectiveness monitoring. It was before that big event, And so you're still looking very specifically on some, measures that were important when you started. And so so how do you know, or would you know, how your monitoring is impacted by the positive things we've done, or somehow modified or amplified by the holiday fire? And I think that's that's such a big question, but just to maybe somehow address that and how you are approaching it, because I think that's just going to be a repeated disturbance throughout Oregon in the future. So that's not an easy thing, but that's what popped into my mind when you mentioned that, because you mentioned it a couple of times about the holiday farm fire. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Liz, for just sharing that. And I'll make sure that is addressed at the presentation. I don't think I can do that today, but I am meeting with later this afternoon with the McKenzie Watershed Council and the Upper Deschutes Watershed to prepare for our April presentation. So I wrote some notes, so I'll make sure that is.
And I'm reaching way back into the gray matter, a quarter of a century ago or more. But I was down on doing recovery on the Biscuit fire or the Silver Fire years ago, and I remember that our forest ecologist, Dr. Tom Matz, had said a big surprise was the charcoaling effect from those large logs that fell into Silver Creek, and how actually it was a really positive thing in the first year post following in because of the charcoaling effect. And that was kind of a surprise. So anyway, just a thought.
Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Chris, you got a question, comment? Oh, you're on mute.
Thanks, Barbara. Hey, Ken, thanks for that presentation. I just wanted to express support for effectiveness monitoring of these types of restoration actions. The Fish and Wildlife Service has contributed funding to the South Fork McKenzie Stage 0, so I'm pretty familiar with it, but just wanted to provide additional rationale for supporting the effectiveness monitoring of these types of actions. They're very expensive, quite a huge lift, huge investment, but the ecosystem benefits of these types of actions are equally massive. But I think we need to demonstrate the value of making these types of investments through the monitoring of their effectiveness. And I think there's a lot of information that has come out of our initial monitoring so far of both that project and the Whitefish Creek Stage 0. But I think continuing to provide support for comprehensive monitoring to demonstrate their effectiveness for others out there, not just in Oregon, but the Northwest and nationally for these types of actions. It's critically important. So just wanted to offer my support for it.
Thank you, Chris. So Ken, you had mentioned Nature Conservancy and PGE. I guess I didn't really retain what that relationship was.
Yeah, so I was saying earlier that the Upper Deschutes Watershed Council had some delays associated with COVID and restoration permitting. And so they were able to weather that delay and continue monitoring in the interim with funding that was provided by Portland General Electric, because there is a hydroelectric project in the Deschutes Basin, and some of that funding supports conservation efforts, including monitoring. And so the mechanism is PGE passes it through to the Nature Conservancy, and they have a grant program, and Upper Deschutes Watershed Council was successful at receiving some of those dollars to continue monitoring. And so they didn't have to ask OWEB to fill that gap. And so now the funding they're asking us will wrap up this long-term monitoring project.
Thank you. I didn't get that. So that's helpful. Thank you.
And
Any
I
other
breezed
questions?
through, so yeah, no, thanks for asking the follow.
Thanks. Any other questions or comments from committee members? Or any staff have anything they want to add? All right,
The only
thank you.
If you guys have any questions or comments that come up between now and the board meeting, just feel free to email or call me or Eric Williams, you know, and we'll try to incorporate that or address it, but really just look forward to the conversation at the April board meeting. So thank you.
Thank you, Ken. All right, moving on down the next agenda item. Dan, it's yours.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. Next one is maybe it should be yours. It's the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program grant requests. And I understand that Taylor is not going to join us this morning and that Eric Williams is going to be filling in for him. Eric?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Co-Chair Brown, members of the committee. As Dan just mentioned, I'm filling in for Taylor Larson on this one this morning. We were very excited to host an Oregon Agricultural Commission meeting last Thursday over at Silver Falls State Park. For the first time since the inception of the Ag Heritage Program, we are in position to be recommending grants to the OWEB board for programs authorized under the Agricultural Heritage Program statute. And just as a little bit of reminder or background, the statute, which was passed in 2017, authorizes grants for 4 different aspects of the program: conservation easements, conservation management plans, succession planning, and technical assistance. And as you might recall, there was no funding for those grants for the first several years of the program's existence until short session last year appropriated $5 million to the commission. The commission recommended, and the OWEB board included in its spending plan for this biennium, allocating those funds across 2 of those 4 program offerings: conservation easement grants and conservation management plan grants. And so staff conducted a solicitation with applications that came in October and embarked on a pretty thorough review process, similar to the way that we provide technical review for all applications that come in to OWEB, and presented, as in accordance with program rules, staff recommendations and rankings for funding, which is a little bit different than I think what the OWEB board is used to seeing. The rules for the Ag Heritage Program have staff actually providing rankings to the commission. The commission then provides funding recommendations to the OWEB board, who then makes the awards. And so this agenda item on the grants committee today is just simply a preview of what you're going to see for your April board meeting agenda with respect to Ag Heritage Program awards. And it was a very interesting position that we were put in with the applications that came in the door, particularly for the conservation easements. The conservation management plan grants, we only received 2 applications totaling $66,000, which was well under the dollar amount that was included in the spending plan, which was $150,000. Both of those applications were recommended by the commission for funding. So you'll see those on your April agenda. For the conservation easement grants, we received 7 applications, all of which were recommended for funding. They all met the evaluation criteria to be worthy of funding. Staff did put them in rank order as required by rule, and presented that to the commission to make its funding recommendation. And I'll just show you real quickly here what the funding recommendation was from staff to the commission. So as you can see, the 7 applications that we received totaled $5.5 million, which is more than we have funds available. We had about $4.2 million available. And the number 1 project in the staff ranking was a project that requested a little over $4 million, which necessitated a funding line, if you will, underneath that first project. The commission then looked at all of the evaluation materials that were presented to them and discussed their recommendation to the OWEB board. And where they landed, and you'll see this in the OWEB board staff report for the April meeting, is they decided to recommend to the OWEB board funding all 7 applications, and with a partial award being funded to that Wild Rivers Land Trust project for the Wall Ranch conservation easement. You'll see the final numbers in the staff report, but it's at about $2.6 million. And so, of course, that will be dependent on the applicant being willing to accept that award, which will likely be determined based on their ability to fundraise for the remaining dollar amount. And so we wanted to preview this for you today, so that you have at least a little bit of background when you get the staff report, and based on any questions that you might have today, might be a little bit better informed than other board members. And just as a reminder of the Ag Heritage Commission setup, it's got 11 voting members, and it also has an ex officio member, non-voting, from the OWEB board. And our co-chair today, Barbara Boyer, serves in that ex officio position on the Ag Heritage Commission. And so she was participating in these conversations as well. So let me take this off the screen and stop there to see if anyone has questions about what you're going to see at the April board meeting.
Questions from folks? Lindsay?
Yeah, thanks. I have a question. So if I'm understanding it correctly, the Ag Board is the one making the decisions and OWEB is the pass-through for the funding. So that's kind of question 1. And then question 2 is if they've elected for partial funding, but funding all 7, does that mean subsequent budgets coming in the future would already kind of be pre-allocated?
Thanks, Lindsay, for those questions. Again, Eric Williams, Grant Program Manager. To your first question, the Ag Heritage Commission makes a funding recommendation to the OWEB board. The OWEB board actually decides on the actual grant award. And to your second question, the way that the funding works is that if the applicant accepts the award, we'll enter into a grant agreement, and they'll have an 18-month period to close on the transaction, which is standard for our land acquisition program as well. And if for whatever reason they're unable to close on that transaction, those funds would then be recaptured back into the Agricultural Heritage Fund to be made available for future grant awards.
Thanks, Lindsay. Mark?
Well, Barbara just went away. I was going to ask Barbara a question. So, so Barbara, could you give us your take, being representative from the OWEB board, on how that process went from your perspective?
Well, it was quite a process. I mean, the end of the applications were due at the end of October, and I was impressed with the quality of the report from the end of October to our meeting. It was a heavy lift, and staff did an amazing job. It was robust conversations. We were in consensus, but there was, there was some of the applications were in question. So not so much in question, but just didn't really see that the agricultural value had more. One of the applications had more, looking at my notes, more conservation values like wildlife and wetlands. So there was kind of a conversation that maybe there would be other grants available for that piece of property. But it was still recommended to bring forward to fund. And they were amazing applications. And one of my points bringing forward is we really didn't, I think the point I made was this particular meeting was setting the tone for the future of this program. And for the health of the program, we really didn't want to fund just one application. It was important to this particular committee or commission to fund all of them with available funding. And hopefully the Wall Ranch will take less. I don't know the answer, and I don't know what that looks like if they say they cannot. So that was going to be one of my questions today. Like, what does it look like if the Wall Ranch said, yeah, well, we're going to wait. So, but yeah, there was a lot of weight given to that conversation. Is that helpful, Mark?
Yep. Lisa, could you give your perspective? 'Cause I understand you attended the meeting too.
Yeah, it definitely was. It was a great set of applications. There was a lot of public comment on the process. I think we have some process things that we can do some work on, and we'll be working with a couple of committees to look at the rules and then the application criteria, et cetera. So that part of it I would set aside. I think the commissioners did a great job of really evaluating each of the projects, talking about them based on the criteria. The criteria are not weighted. And so that is an interesting piece, I think, going forward, probably for some consideration, given there are other avenues for conservation funding, fewer avenues potentially for agricultural working lands. I think what I heard very strongly, and Barbara touched on it, was this set the tone going forward. And I think there was a clear desire to show a diversity of projects across the state that represented different types of operations, and not taking away from the importance of others, but just a real need to, bring that diversity into this first offering. And that's how ultimately I think that the commission came down to, let's fund, and there were a couple of different proposals for funding the projects, but fund all of them, because the other ones, other than the Wall Ranch, were significantly smaller amounts to match, and then make the adjustment to the Wall Ranch offering. It really was a robust discussion, and a set of commissioners that had put a tremendous amount of time and effort in to studying the material and thinking about it. So all in all, for a first offering, I think the meeting went very, very well. Our staff that did the prep work and the presentations were absolutely amazing and outstanding, working through the issues. And the commissioners, and we had some new commissioners on, they all brought a great perspective and an open perspective to the conversation from their different backgrounds.
Well, and it definitely shows the interest in the program. So if, legislators were sitting back watching or will watch and say, is there going to be interest in this program? Well, definitely there's interest.
There's definitely interest.
Those applications. So I think I chatted with you about this, but just to make sure I totally understand this, we probably will not have the appraisal decision, or the appraisal out there, the decision from the Walls or the recommendation prior to the April meeting, but it doesn't matter either way, right?
Yeah, I would anticipate we don't have an appraisal yet. The April meeting just seems like a pretty short turnaround for that, is my sense.
The only thing that could potentially happen, Mark, is the applicant could decide to make public comment at the board meeting. But other than that, we won't have any further information about that.
Okay, thank you.
And to answer Barbara's question too, she asked, what if that applicant decides not to accept the award? What happens then? That the answer to that is dependent on what happens in the legislative session with the program. There is a bill, as you know, it's the funds for the program were new funds were not included in the governor's request budget, but there is a bill to appropriate $10 million into the program. And so if that bill passes, we would be ramping up for another solicitation fairly quickly. We would include the $2.6 million if it's not accepted into the pot for the next solicitation. If new funds are not included at the end of the legislative session for this budget, then we'll have to make some decisions. I think it'd be very challenging for us to go through another solicitation cycle, knowing that we won't have staff after the biennium to operate to administer the grant. So we'll have to talk further about that contingency and what we want to do with the $2.6 million at that time. And I also wanted to provide a comment too on this notion of weighting of different criteria. The commission spent a lot of time talking about that. And prior to that, as the constituents and stakeholders were working on the statute itself, there was a lot of talk about conservation values, habitat values, and ag values. It was very intentional, both in the statute and the rules, not to weight them. And in fact, during the development of the statute, the term that people tended to use most in talking about wildlife habitat and ag values was integration of those values on a particular property. And then as the commission was going through rule development, they very intentionally decided not to include any weighting of the different criteria. And when you read through the criteria, and you'll see this all in the staff report for the board meeting next month, when you read through those criteria, you'll see that there are criteria that dive into wildlife habitat aspects. There are criteria that dive into agricultural aspects, as well as things like impacts on neighboring lands, things to that effect. And the commission did not want to get into a situation where you're kind of pitting one value against another, because that's not the intention of the program. And the program is set up to recognize the integrated values that these properties provide to both agricultural and wildlife habitat. So I just wanted to add that in closing, and we'll see if there's any further questions before we move to the next item.
All right, thank you, Eric. I'm not seeing any other hands raised, so I'll kick it back to Barbara for the last agenda item.
Thank you. All right, our last one, Eric, you are up on open solicitation, please.
All right, thank you, Co-Chair Boyer. Again, Eric Williams, Grant Program Manager. And this again is just a preview item for the committee to prep you a little bit for the board discussion in April around the open solicitation grant awards. And as you'll recall, we have open solicitation awards every 6 months. And so there are 4 cycles in a biennium. And this being the last one in the biennium, it means that we sometimes are in a situation where we have maybe a little bit more money if we haven't spent it all during the course of the biennium. And that's the case this time around. And just to run through the 3 categories that we have, and as a reminder, monitoring grants are only offered once a year, and this cycle does not include monitoring. So we've got restoration, technical assistance, and stakeholder engagement grants. And to run through what the spending plan balances are, and to give you an idea of how that compares to what we typically have in a cycle, for restoration, we have $10.5 million remaining in that spending plan line item. Typically, we're allocating in the range of $8 million per cycle. So quite a bit of extra money there. In technical assistance, we have $2.3 million remaining in the spending plan, where typically we're allocating about $1 million. For stakeholder engagement, we have $1.5 million remaining, where typically we're allocating $500,000. And I'm not going to show you any charts or spreadsheets today because we're still working on polishing up the final evaluations, and we'll be posting those soon, well in advance of the board meeting. But what I did want to prep you for is how the conversation will be structured for the April board meeting. And given the more than what is typical dollar amounts available, we were able to go deeper than we normally are across all the categories. And when we looked at restoration, we found that we could fund most but not all projects with the remaining balance in the restoration category. And there are a cluster of projects, I think 5 of them, that we kind of put into this second bucket that if the board is willing to reallocate excess balances from the other spending plan categories, which we will have, then we'd like the board to consider that second bucket as a group. And the reason we did that is because when we look at making funding line recommendations, we're looking at the strengths and concerns articulated in the evaluations. And we found that with that second group of 5 or so projects, some of the concerns or the level of concerns were fairly similar. And rather than trying to pick off one project and see whether you want to move it above the line, we wanted to take those as a group. And if the board felt the projects were worthy, go ahead and make the motion to move funds around in the spending plan. And so if that happens, we will be able to fund almost all of the recommended projects in the restoration category. For technical assistance and stakeholder engagement, we will be in the position to recommend funding all of the recommended projects after going through the TRT process. And so that's really all we wanted to present here today. And just because that approach is a little bit different in terms of what you'll see in April, the regional program representatives will be giving a detailed presentation about the recommended projects like we typically do. But just wanted to highlight a little bit different structure of the recommended motions for you come April. So let me stop there and see if anyone has any questions.
Any questions or comments for Eric on this agenda item? I have one, Eric. So you had talked about in the restoration reallocating money. Have you identified where that would come from yet?
From the technical assistance and stakeholder engagement categories, because even at full funding of those recommended projects, there are still leftover funds. There would be still leftover funds. So keeping within the open solicitation category, the spending plan, and very specifically pulling from the other 2 project types.
Okay, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. So thank you. All right, anything else? Oh, Mark's got a question.
Well, it's just a comment, and it's not related to any agenda item, but I had one of the stakeholders wearing my hat as a Fish and Wildlife Commission member bring this up. And so I thought it well worth bringing it up to this group, mainly as just an information item for right now, because I need to talk to Eric some more about it. But the question came up from one of the large stakeholder groups that Department of Fish and Wildlife works with, about whether our grant projects where we are requiring as part of the grant project a fence, and it may be a fence around a spring or a project to protect, cattle or whatever against a riparian area, whatever it is. If we have a fencing project, are we considering wildlife friendly fencing? And I said, I don't know the answer to that question, but I will bring it up to staff, at least and begin the discussion on that. Because as some of us know, like antelope, for example, antelope will not jump a fence. They will go under. That's the only way they go, is go under a fence. And if the fence is barbed wire and it's close to the ground, we've all seen the pictures of antelope hung up in a fence. And so we've all seen pictures of fawns stuck in fences. So they were questioning and asking about that. So I just wanted to let the grant committee, I'm going to be delving into that with staff to see if that's something that we have thought about. If we haven't thought about it, should we think about it? And so just members of the grant committee letting you know that I'm going to be asking those questions. So I don't know the answer at this point in time, but I told them I would bring that up. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Eric.
Thanks, Barbara, and thanks, Mark, for bringing that up to the committee. One of the things that I recall having discussed this issue is going back a few years, and this came up on one of our land acquisition projects where a new management plan was due, and there were still some grazing on an adjacent property, and so they were going over what kind of fencing to put up there. And there was a desire to put in wildlife friendly fencing. And when we went through that discussion, and again, I don't know if this is still the case today, but when we went through that discussion, we found that there was not a official definition of wildlife friendly fencing from the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. I don't know if that's changed since that time. I think we ended up using a formal definition from the state of Montana or someplace. But it would be helpful if we could learn more about the current status of that particular designation and ODFW, anything ODFW might have either in rules or guidance on it.
So the ball's back in my court, it looks like.
I guess that's what I'm saying, Mark.
like I'm saying, I'm still trying to gather information on this, so I will do some checking on my end.
No good deed goes unpunished.
Thank you very much.
All right, are there any other closing comments? All right, not hearing any. We did it, you guys, in exactly an hour and a half. Good job. All right, thanks everybody for your help today and your time, and enjoy the rest of today.